Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for the webinar on supply chain management. We wanted to thank PPPC for having us present to you today, but before we get started, we just need to give our quick disclaimer. Material presented during this webinar is based on the best available information as of today, and as standards continue to evolve, information included in the presentation is subject to change. UL will continue to provide recommendations and consultation to our clients based on the newest and best information available. This information presented is provided by UL for educational and informational purposes only. The company makes no warranties or representations about specific dates, coverages, or applications. We recommend that you consult with appropriate legal counsel about the specific application of the law to your business and to your products. Today's webinar is being conducted under mute conditions. We encourage you to ask questions using the chat window, which is located on the right lower portion of your screen. We'll answer any questions that we receive at the end of the webinar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. As Regulatory Services Regional Manager for the Global Technical Resource Group at UL, Andrew Farhat strategically examines regulatory changes to assess impact on the business operations of consumer product retailers, manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers. Through targeted research and analysis, Andrew works with clients to implement value-added solutions to meet the requirements of evolving legislations. Actively involved in the quality assurance industry for over 10 years, Andrew has experience in a broad range of consumer products, including toys, textiles, and apparel, and general merchandise. Memberships include the American Apparel and Footwear Association, American Society for Testing and Materials International, International Organization for Standardization, and the Toy Industry Association. Andrew, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Haley, for that introduction, and thanks for having me for today's webinar. As we all know, we're going to talk about product safety in our supply chain. We're going to talk about ways that we can implement best practices throughout our supply chain to meet the evolving challenges that we face from a product safety standpoint. So with that being said, why are we talking about this? Well, first and foremost, lots of product recalls have occurred over the last 8 years, starting in 2007, and these recalls, what they do is they shake a lot of public confidence. Consumers get concerned about products, they're worried about safety, and so that makes us have to be much more aware of product safety. Manufacturers are also facing much more strict and product safety standards and requirements depending on the markets they go into. And there's a constant demand for the development of new and innovative consumer products. That adds to the challenge. As the demand for new products, new innovations occur, new hazards are created from these innovative products. And so with that being said, product lifecycle management and traceability are now essential when we talk about product safety. So back to the recalls. So in 2007, a lot of people termed that year the year of the recall. We had recalled spinach, if some of us can remember that. There was recalls of peanut butter here in the U.S. There was an easy bake oven that a lot of us probably are familiar with. At least my younger sisters back in the day had this. They made changes to the design of this. The changes they thought were good, but ultimately where you'd actually insert the little sleeve to go in to cook your little cake actually was the perfect size to fit a children's finger and get it entrapped in there. And that was recalled. It all led up to the big recall that Mattel faced from the Thomas the Tank, from the paint standpoint. And just to give you a little bit of a summary of what Mattel faced in 2007, they faced a litany of recalls based off of a lot of it being lead requirements. So on August 2nd, they recalled 1.5 million of these Fisher-Price toys for lead. 2 weeks later, they recalled 17 million products for loose magnets. 2 weeks later, almost another million due to lead paint. And so you can see, over the course of just 1 year, Mattel took about 20 million products off the market based off of recalls. So what are the ramifications of these recalls? Well, many countries, based on these recalls and these hazards, they revised and passed much more stringent requirements. The U.S. passed the CCPSA, Canada improved their CCPSA, and all of these were modified and modernized to meet the new requirements, the new safety requirements that consumers are looking for. It should be noted that compliance with one of the country standards doesn't really guarantee that you're going to comply with another country's standards. So if you meet U.S. requirements, that's not to say you're going to meet Canada's requirements or vice versa. Some of these new requirements that we saw included documentation requirements, documented safety programs, potentially certification requirements, and in some countries they required third-party testing by accredited laboratories. It really depends on the country's requirements. The presentation is not going to be about the standards and the requirements. I'm going to do 2 or 3 brief slides on some of the requirements. So from a Canadian standpoint, we have the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act, the Hazardous Products Act, the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act, the Textile Act, and the Charter of the French Language, to name a few. And within those, you can see that CCPSA came into effect in 2011, and the purpose was to protect the public by addressing or preventing dangers to human health. Really, it was a modernization of the previous act they had. It defines what a consumer product is, and it talks about what a danger to the human health or safety is, and that is defined as any unreasonable hazard, existing or a potential hazard, that is posed by a consumer product during or as a result of its normal or foreseeable use, and that may be expected to cause death or adverse health effects. That's a very broad definition to what's a danger. There are lots of regulations under the Act. Some of the more notable ones are the toy regulation, the textile flammability regulations, the phthalate regulations, the children's jewelry regulations. Those are to name a few, but there's a lot of them in here, and each of these particular regulations impacts a certain product category or product categories. Some of the key elements of the CCPSA include the ability to order a recall and other corrective actions. As I mentioned before, documentation, document control, so record keeping is going to be part of an element of the CCPSA. That record keeping allows traceability in the potential event of a recall. There's mandatory reporting requirements. There's the ability to require testing and studies to verify compliance, and also increase fines and penalties. In the U.S., as I mentioned, as a result of those recalls in 2007, the U.S. passed what they call the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act in 2008. And that is just an amendment to the existing legislation they had in place, but it put much more teeth into the regulations, much more strict requirements, third-party testing requirements, certification requirements, record-keeping requirements. Some of the acts that the CPSC, who's the regulator in the U.S., has under their jurisdiction is the Flammable Fabrics Act. The FDA has the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's for food, drugs, and cosmetics. The FTC has fiber identification and care labeling. That's more associated with textiles and apparel. In Europe, they have what they call the General Product Safety Directive, which is the overarching regulation for product safety of consumer products. And within that, they have something called the Toy Safety Directive that's geared towards toys, and that's been modernized over the last few years and has very much more strict requirements from a chemical standpoint than most of the other country requirements, especially the U.S. and Canada. The European Toy Safety Directive, from a chemical standpoint, regulates 19 different heavy metals, so much more strict. They also have REACH, which is the Restriction and Evaluation and Authorization of Chemicals, ROHS, which is more for electronic products. EN 71 is the toy standard, and CE is the certification marking for all products that are under a harmonized standard in Europe. It's just a broad overview of the European requirements. There are also voluntary standards, and when we say voluntary, there's a differentiation to be had between a mandatory standard, one that's mandatory in a country, versus one that's voluntary or is good to have, not necessarily mandated or required. And so the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, they have many standards that they're based off of independent non-governmental organization that comes up with these standards, and 164 countries participate in the standards process there, and they have over 19,000 standards covering everything from food to computers. ASTM International is a U.S.-based organization. They also produce voluntary standards, and they have around 12,000 standards. And then our organization, Underwriters Laboratory, we also create our own standards, and those standards encompass UL's extensive safety research and our scientific expertise. and focus on quality and safety. A lot of them focus more on the electrical and fire safety side of things. We have about over 1,000 standards, and it's good to note that our UL standards are utilized by all independent laboratories. So not just UL, but other laboratories utilize those UL standards as well. So as I said, we had recalls. We had a modernization of a lot of the mandatory requirements, not just in Canada, but in the US and Europe, some of the major markets. And because of the recalls and because of these new, the new accountability that's going to be placed on these requirements, there's now new responsibility for importers and manufacturers who are ultimately responsible for product compliance. So those of us who bring product into the market here, offer it for sale, or give it away and bring it into commerce here are ultimately responsible. It's important for those entities to have a documented reasonable testing program and compliance policies in place. Try to implement technologies and methods for having some traceability of your products and of the raw materials that are used in your products to the best of your ability. Understanding that supply chains are becoming more and more complex. We're not just one layer away from the manufacturer, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 levels away from that manufacturer. So it becomes more and more difficult and that much more important to ensure that we have that type of relationship with the suppliers and the vendors to have that understanding of what's going into our products. And the last thing I put it here is designing out product hazards. And that's something that a lot of manufacturers are looking at. They're looking at the inherent design of that product. And before they even conceptualize that product, they're trying to design out hazards from that product so that it doesn't have any issues at the end of the line. At the end of the day, the need for better supply chain management is upon us. It's not. It's the day and age of being able to just say, I'm bringing a product in and that's it. That's over. Now it's really about understanding your supply chain and getting much more involved in it when you can. So when we look at the product life cycle, this is a huge slide. It's a complex slide, but I'm going to try to break it down rather simplistically. And then we're going to go through each of these 5 or 6 stages that I like to talk about. So if we talk about the first stage, which in the middle of that big arrow, we see product concept. That's when we're talking about the concept of that actual product, the design of that product, understanding how that product's been designed. Once we kind of have a product design, a product concept down, we talk about vendor selection, determining what vendor we want to go with, what manufacturer we're going to choose, and there's lots of ways you can vet those suppliers to make a better informed decision on who's going to make this product for you. And when we talk about children's products, that vendor selection is that much more important. So we can looking at auditing of the factory and supplier qualifications of that factory. When we talk about pre-production, that's the next step. So once we've chosen our vendor, once we've decided we're going forward with this vendor, we talk about pre-production of that product. So we're talking about choosing raw materials, looking at the traceability of those raw materials through the supply chain, and better understanding what materials go into our products. You could even do some pre-production testing to test your raw materials or testing to failure, things of that nature that give you a better idea of what materials you're using in your products. Once we go from pre-production to the actual production of the product, we talk about inspections potentially of the product, pulling product off the line and inspecting it to make sure it meets those requirements, doing compliance and performance testing to ensure that that product meets our requirements from a testing standpoint. And then we talk about the back stages of the production, which is transporting the product, distributing the product, and ultimately it being sold and merchandised in a store or given away as from a promotional standpoint. So you can look at final random inspections of the product. Once all production is done, we can do a final inspection of the product. Everything from auditing from a CT pat or which is more from a safety standpoint of importing that product. And ultimately, when if it's at a store, you could do analysis of the merchandise in the store. This is just a broad example, and I'm going to go into each of these little in more detail as we go through the presentation. The product concept. Some things to look at when we talk about product concept, when we're talking about conceptualizing an idea. We talk about human factors, which goes well above the standards. So looking at how a human is going to interact with that product, trying to anticipate that foreseeable use, and actually the unintended use scenarios that that product might face when it's actually being used by a consumer, to better understand and enhance the interaction between the user and the product. And ultimately, you can work with product designers to remove foreseeable hazards prior to the manufacture of that product. If you want to take it a step further, we can even go into data. And NICE data is actually data that's been compiled from emergency rooms and hospitals of injuries and fatalities from certain consumer products. So you can look at NICE data. You can look at research journals. The CCPSA and Health Canada, they publish data. The National Institute of Health here in the U.S. has publications of medical literature. There's all types of data that you can utilize to make better decisions when you're conceptualizing a product. Other things that you can do is you can actually conduct behavioral analysis. You can identify steps associated with the product use. So each of these steps has a decision juncture. So when you're assembling the product, how you use the product, cleaning it, troubleshooting any issues you have with the product. If there's a disassembly aspect of it, you're going to look at how it's disassembled, and you're going to look at the storage of the product, looking at each of these different steps and how that product is used and better understanding how someone's going to behave and react to that product. You could conduct research as well, looking at, like I said, previous data, doing observational studies where you're able to put children into a room, and there are third parties that can do this, where you put children in a room, you give them that product, and you observe. You watch them, see how they use that product. It gives you it's pretty eye-opening to see how children use products. It's pretty interesting. This is just a really simplistic graph that kind of gives you an idea of when it makes sense to design the hazard out. And so if you look at this chart, at the top you have severity of the injury. So 4 being the most severe and 1 being the least severe. And then you look at the probability of an issue from impossible to almost certain that it's going to happen. And based on the severity of the injury and how the probability of it occurring, you're able to see where there's a very severe probability and where there's a high, where there's a significant, and where there's a low probability. And wherever you see those S's, or severe probability, I would think that's an area to look at in terms of phasing out those types of hazards from that, based on the injury being severe and the probability being quite high. So if we take a step further, and we're done with designing this product and conceptualizing it, we're going to talk about the vendor selection now. There are a multitude of different audits and things that can be done to vet or to check out a factory or a vendor before you go forward with actually using them. Some of these types of audits include looking at the initial factory qualifications. Is that factory fiscally able to maintain business? Are they not going to close up shop once we start working with them? The next one is quality and capability audit. Are they capable of producing these products for us? Are they capable of producing the types of quality we're looking for? You can look at the quality assessment systems, look at how they monitor their production, looking at good manufacturing practices, looking at from a sanitation standpoint, a product safety standpoint, an OSHA or a social standpoint, and then from a social or compliance standpoint, meaning do they have the right processes implemented to ensure that they're utilizing and paying their workforce properly, that the work conditions are safe, that they're not employing child labor. Because all of these have a ramifications above and beyond the quality of the product and the safety of the product, but it could have a ramification on your brand. We see it time and time again. Big brands are hit upon this by NGOs who identify child labor or issues that really damage the brand of that product. I'm going to focus on 3 of these. I'm going to focus on quality and capability audit first. So what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of this type of an audit? Well, the strengths of the manufacturing industry are that it's relatively stable. The demand of manufacturing, it fluctuates in ups and downs based on demand at different time periods of the year. And manufacturing has become highly efficient over the last century with the ability to maximize both the productivity of the workers and the machines to maximize profits. The biggest weakness, though, is that it lacks control. And a lot of times this has to do with internal processes, quality control activities, and even the workforce. And what we see nowadays is there's lots of turnover, lots of fluctuation in the workforce at these vendors at the factory level. What we used to see was a very, very constant workforce that didn't change much. And because it didn't change much, it was a much more low risk of any issues occurring. Now when you see big turnout, big turnover, you see the challenges of retraining workforce, making sure they understand what they're doing, and when you have that, you open yourself up to the possibility of lack of control. We talk about responsible sourcing audit. That's another type of audit, and another way you can vet your suppliers. We can look at it, like I said, from a social compliance standpoint, from a safety standpoint, CTPAT, that's more from ensuring that your containers are safe when they leave the port. You can monitor the supply chain through audits, training education, consultation, and stakeholder engagement. There's also conflict mineral requirements. So you can look at different publications, country labor law profiles, risk indexes, best practice manuals. But here's ways you can vet your suppliers from a responsible or social standpoint. So pre-production. There's ways we can utilize some pre-production testing. We can look at what we call research testing. That's testing to failure or upper limits. So we're looking at, and some of this is complex, and I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds. If there are questions about this, we can take them either after, or if you want to email us, we can definitely dive into deeper on these topics. But some of these are a little more complex, and I don't want to drive too deep. But when I talk about testing to failure or upper limit, I'm looking at telling you to test until it fails, and you're able to really get an idea of how strong or robust that product is versus just testing to see if it meets the requirement. And that's based off a statistical analysis of the results. We can look at raw material qualifications. So a lot of suppliers are going to look at, and they're going to qualify what materials they feel are safe to use in their product from a heavy metal standpoint, from a lead standpoint, from a phthalate standpoint of wet inks and plastics, toxics and packaging. So you can vet your raw materials and ensure your raw materials are going to be compliant before you even use them. And you can also do pre-production of mechanical testing to client standards. Enhanced criteria based on global safety standards. So if you're looking at selling it to multiple markets, you can look at the most strict requirements and do your pre-production testing based off of that, knowing that it should meet most of the other requirements if it passes the most strict ones. Production. So once we are in production and we're testing the product in production testing, we can look at testing from a multitude of standpoints. First and foremost, we look at it from a safety standpoint, making sure it meets the safety requirements. You can look at it from a performance standpoint and a quality standpoint to make sure our products are going to meet quality requirements. If you have apparel, you want to make sure that it can be laundered and dried, and it's not going to come out and be warped and shrank and unusable. You're going to look at it from the regulatory requirements and ensure that you test it to meet all regulations for that particular country. Any type of claim substantiation. So if you're making claims, for example, on mugs, you're going to make a claim that it's dishwasher and microwave safe. You're going to want to make sure that you substantiate that. You're going to test that product during production to make sure that if I take that mug and I put it in a microwave, it's not going to explode. Or if I put it in the dishwasher, it's not going to come out cracked. You can also do benchmarking or product comparisons where you're going to compare your product against other people's products to see where it stacks up. And ultimately, you could do focus groups if you really wanted to, but that's on the higher end. When we talk about production testing, this is one of the bigger areas that I want to spend some time on. It's called random and representative sample selection. Back in 2007, when Mattel had the issues that they had, some of the bigger issues they faced was something called golden samples. And with golden samples, that is when a factory or a vendor submits the perfect sample to be tested at the laboratory. That sample is going to have paint and everything that's going to meet every single requirement, but does not represent that production at all. And so what happened to Mattel is their suppliers switched paint. They had no idea. Samples were tested, everything passed, and then the factory said, okay, we can bring in this paint, it's cheaper, They brought it in, and it was very different. It had lead in it. So trying to avoid what I call the golden sample is critical. That's having someone come and independently select that product after production that will independently select it and prevent the factory from sending in that perfect sample. That's critical. That's something to be aware of. Then inspections. When we talk about production inspections, we can talk about what we call top of production inspections. That's more on the raw material side of things. We have initial product inspections. That's looking at the first products that come off that line. Then we talk about in-line or in-process DUPRO inspections. That's between 20 and 40%, so in the first half of your production. And then the last thing I talk about is final random inspection, which is when you have 100% products that have already been produced off the line and 80% or so are packed. And you can look at loading inspections and production monitoring to make sure that those are all done properly. And ultimately, these inspections are typically conducted using ANSI sampling procedures. Some of the benefits that we see from doing these quality inspections is that we definitely see a reduction of non-compliant products. It will, a lot of times, prevent defective products from being shipped because what happens is it's able to be caught before it's shipped. Higher quality levels equal higher customer satisfaction, with a reduction in product returns. And cost-effective means to help ensure that products meet your quality standards prior to shipment. So when we talk about transportation of your product, so once it's produced and it's in your factory and it's going to be shipped now to whatever country you're bringing it into, some countries have what they call trusted trader type programs where they're looking at the safety from a terrorism standpoint of that product carton and that case of product being shipped into the country. In Canada, they have something called Partners in Protection, or PIP, and this program it's a program that you can enroll in, and what it allows you to do is when your products reach the border, your company will be recognized as a trusted trader, which will ultimately have a reduced risk score, which results in less examination rate at the border. You're going to have access to the fast lanes to cross the border into Canada. So what it does is it allows you to fast track your way through customs much quicker than if you were not. Your company will also be recognized as a trusted trader under these mutual agreement recognition agreements they have with other countries. In particular, the U.S. CBP, or the Customs and Border Patrol in the U.S., has what they call CTPAT, and I've mentioned that earlier, and that's the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism Program. Japan has one, Korea has one, Singapore has one, to name a few. So you can see the benefits in doing this PIP, Partners in Production, gives you kind of mutual recognition across many different countries. I'm going to mention just the CTPAT from the U.S. because that's a big program. It's a voluntary supply chain program. It was launched in 2001. And once again, partners must ensure integrity of their supply chain. And they're considered low risk if they do. And ultimately, it gives them fast track through customs if they're part of this. When we talk about getting through customs, whether it's in Canada or in the U.S. or whatnot, there are common issues that we face a lot of times where that may trigger further inspection by the government entities. Some of these cases could be that the repetitive use of a foreign supplier that's found in violation. So if your manufacturer has been flagged before for being in violation of a safety requirement or a regulatory requirement, they get put on the naughty list. And ultimately, they're going to be flagged for further investigation, further inspection. So if you continue to utilize suppliers that are on this bad list, you can expect that your products are going to be inspected more frequently than others. You can also be from incorrect filing of the manufacturer ID on the entry documents. Unmanifested or uninvoiced merchandise will trigger more inspection. Missing invoices. Delay of entry documents if you're working with a broker. Maybe a particular class of your product is under review by the CCPSA or Health Canada to monitor compliance. There might be a particular product category that Health Canada in the U.S. is more concerned about, and if you're importing that particular product in, it's going to face further scrutiny. And from a CCPSA standpoint in the U.S., if your certificate identifies a non-accredited lab, that's going to be a trigger for further inspection. From a store and merchandising standpoint, once it hits the store or once it's being merchandised or once it's being given out, there are other things that you can do once it's on the market. Some of these are, first and foremost, you can look at market surveillance testing. Understanding that you can pull product that is on the shelf and monitor it that way. Because as we said before, sometimes product that we've tested isn't always the product that we're receiving. You could also look at it from your distribution center or your store inspections. You could do an analysis of vendor returns to see where you're finding issues, where are you returning products, why are you getting product returned, and you can see why you're getting product returned by your customers. You can look at failures and look at evaluations of that. You can look at recall assistance, and you can do focus groups once it's on the market. And in summary, from an importer standpoint, know your suppliers. And I can't stress this enough. That relationship building that you do with your suppliers is critical. Know your product. That's easier said than done. Your products are becoming more and more complex, more and more innovative, and having a better understanding of your product is going to be critical in this game. Stay up to date on your regulations, and I would say, lean on your membership you have with PPPC for that. Lean on the relationship you have with your lab partners, whether it's UL or others. They can help keep you up to speed on that. Definitely participate in PIP, that partner program that they have in Canada. Same with CTPAT. Those are going to offer you some good assistance and fast-track your way through customs. If you're an exporter, once again, know your product, know your suppliers. That goes without saying. Ensure compliance with applicable safety requirements of the country of distribution. As I said earlier, depending on the market, the country you're going into, there are different safety and mandatory requirements for those countries. So make sure you ensure that your suppliers are meeting these requirements. And then work with a trusted partner within your country of distribution. That's very critical. Work with someone that you can trust, someone that's a partner who's going to be willing to work with you to ensure that the products you bring in are compliant. And I know I wrapped this up early, but that's all I have. And ultimately, here's some good resources. There's a Health Canada website here. There's a PPI website here if you're interested in going to the PPI's website, the Consumer Product Safety Commission website. And then Haley, who introduced me and kicked off this presentation, here's her email address as well as our website. If you ever had any questions for us, you can always go through Haley. And Haley, I know I ended early, quite early. So if there's any questions, we have plenty of time to take them.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
If not, that's great.
Yeah, we actually, believe it or not, do not have any questions coming through. So I think with that, we will end today's webinar. A copy of the presentation is going to be made available through PPPC. And if you do have any questions that you were not able to ask today, please feel free to reach out. As Andrew mentioned, my contact information is on the screen, and we'll be happy to address those at a later time. So with that, we'll...
Yeah, and I want to, can I mention one thing? I just want to say, once you guys had a chance to digest the presentation a little bit more, like I said, if there's any questions that come up, anything that you want to talk further on, please, the communication is open to both Haley and myself, so please feel free to. That's all I want to say, Haley.
Great, thank you. So with that, we'll close the webinar, and have a great day, everybody.